Hello, you guys got to see my dancing intro. That is usually reserved for Rumble. Just so y'all know, you get to see it every time on Rumble whenever I play on a gaming stream. How are y'all doing? Welcome to Storytime. I know it's been a little while, like 2 weeks at least since the last time. I think last time I had family stuff, so I apologize. I'm echoing. Really? Gosh dang it. I can't tell. Usually I can hear myself. Oh, okay. Wow. Darth Call, you're just making me think I'm... Hello as well. Hi, Vanilla Kung. Hi, Eric. Hi, Holocron. Our girl has the hot library and look down. I mean, I could. Do I have my glasses? This isn't my real glasses. This is my fake Gary glasses. I don't know. It's so cringe. All right, I'm gonna stop being a thought right now. That was so cringe. Who else do we have here? We have Real. No OnlyFans, Vanilla Kung. There's no OnlyFans. Only you guys. You guys are my OnlyFans. Trace Adams, what's up? And Worldwide, hi. Prater Lupus, what's up? No, Darth Call, you are not a fail. You're not a fail. I mean, how many times have I streamed and I've like severely failed at just having correct audio? It's not a surprise when it does happen. So my game crashes on me all the time. You know, it's all good. It's all good. Hi, Nick. Your workout inspired me earlier. I like it. Librarian Xray for the win. Thank you. Worldwide, are you working out right now? Like, earlier I said that if I take my sweater off, I'll show my guns. I'm so excited. They're like, look, it's a little piece, so cute. It's actually so freaking cute how adorable my little muscle is. I specialize in messing up my audio. Well, join the club. So heal, it's 2 a.m. over here. Put me to sleep. I will. Yeah, I can't wait to actually finish the book because I do have plans to, if this is your first time here, when I finish all the audio series of reading this book, I am going to put all the audio together and video. Maybe not the video, we'll see. I might put like stars or something. And then you'll have a continuous stream of the story read. Also, I'm so excited. I went to the thrift store because I was looking for just like a shelf. Nothing crazy, nothing fancy. And they had a section with books, and you know, I love Penguin Classics because most of the time they're books I can read online. So I got this book for like $2.50. It's the Dracula by Bram Stoker, and I also got the Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo. So like more stuff, and this is like $1.50 and $2.50. This is so cheap. I love like reusing books like that. Will you and Mark ever move to the US? Jose, I don't know. It's a maybe. It's a maybe. Both are really good books. I've not read those, so I'm excited. I mean, I've read this and I loved it. So I do love horror books. And this one, it's funny because I remember being good, but now that I'm reading it, it is phenomenal. Like the writing, the dialogue, the setup, and I love getting into like their heads, so to speak. And it makes me miss reading a lot because I don't know, when I was younger, my like identity in terms of things I enjoyed doing that wasn't my extracurriculars was reading. I had like a little mini library. I went to the library all the time, almost like twice a week, so I could read books, bring them back, read more books, bring them back. So yeah, it was great. So yeah, if this is your first time here, again, I'm going to just put this announcement out there. I am going to read this continuously. I will not be reading super chats or donations until the very end, unless any come through right now. I'll address them as they do, and or as they come. And yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited. I hope you guys enjoy it. When does Mark retire? 10 years, I'd say, at least. Books in the public domain that can be read online. I did not know you could do that. I assumed any read books would cause a copyright strike. No, yeah, so as long as they're public domain, it's great. So that's why Penguin Classics is like my favorite, because even though it's produced by them, they don't have the power to strike you down. And hey, there's a couple of people that reached out to me that have stories that they wanted me to read, like some short stories. So I might do that as well. I do that as well. Used to be a big fan of the No Sleep podcast, especially the first 2 seasons. I've never heard that. Never heard of that. Might have to check it out. Right now I'm doing a lot of research in terms of paranormal stuff because I want to learn more. I want to learn more. Forbidden Frontier has opened a new world for me. So yeah, I'm going to start reading. I'm going to try to read for about an hour, and then yeah, hopefully you guys enjoy. Although I do have to say I do prefer a male voice when I read, but I hope you guys enjoy. All right. So the last chapter we on is called Dr. Lanyon's Narrative. On the 9th of January, now 4 days ago, I received by the evening delivery a registered envelope addressed in the hand of my colleague and old school companion, Henry Jekyll. I was a good deal surprised by this, for we were by no means in the habit of correspondence. I had seen the man, dined with him, indeed, the night before, and I could imagine nothing in our intercourse that should justify the formality of registration. The contents increased my wonder, for this is how the letters ran. 10th December, 18. Dear Lanyon, you are one of my oldest friends, and although we may have differed at times on scientific questions, I cannot remember, at least on my side, any break in our affection. There was never a day when you had said to me, Jekyll, my life, my honor, my reason, depend upon you. I would not have sacrificed my fortune or my left hand to help you. Lanyon, my life, my honor, my reason are all at your mercy. If you fail me tonight, I am lost. You might suppose after this preface that I am going to ask you for something dishonorable to grant. Judge for yourself. I want you to postpone all other engagements for tonight. Even if you were summoned to the bedside of an emperor, to take a cab, unless your carriage should be actually at the door, and with this letter in your hand for consultation, to drive straight to my house. Poole, my butler, has his orders, and you will find him waiting for your arrival with a locksmith. The door of my cabinet is then to be forced, and you are to go in alone to open the glazed letter E on the left hand, breaking the lock if it be shut, and to draw out with all its contents as they stand, the 4th drawer from the top, or which is the same thing, the 3rd from the bottom. In my extreme distress of mind, I have a morbid fear of misdirecting you. But even if I am in error, you may know the right drawer by its contents, some powders, a file, and a paper book. This drawer I beg of you to carry back with you to Cavendish Square, exactly as it stands. This is the first part of the service. Now for the second. You should be back, if you set out at once on the receipt of this, long before midnight, but I will leave you that amount of margin, not only in the fear of one of those obstacles that can neither be prevented nor foreseen, but because an hour when your servants are in bed is to be preferred for what will then remain to do. At midnight, then, I have to ask you to be alone in your consulting room, to admit with your own hand into the house a man who will present himself in my name, and to place his hands in the drawer that you will have brought with you from my cabinet. Then you will have played your part and earned my gratitude completely. 5 minutes afterwards, you are to insist upon an explanation. You will have understood that these arrangements are a capital importance, and by the neglect of one of them, fantastic as they must appear, you must have charged your conscience with my death or the shipwreck of my reason. Confident as I am that you will not trifle with this appeal, my heart sinks and my hands tremble at the bare thought of such a possibility. Think of me at this hour, in a strange place, laboring under a blackness of distress that no fancy can exaggerate, and yet well aware that, if you will but punctually serve me, my troubles will roll away like a story that is told. Serve me, my dear Lanyon, and save. Your friend, H.J. P.S. I had already sealed this up when a fresh terror struck upon my soul. It is possible that the post office may fail me and this letter not come into your hands until tomorrow morning. In that case, dear Lanyon, do my errand when it shall be most convenient for you in the course of the day, and once more expect my messenger at midnight. It may then already be too late, but if that night passes without event, you will know that you have seen the last of Henry Jekyll. Upon the reading of this letter, I made sure my colleague was insane. But till that was proved beyond the possibility of a doubt, I felt bound to do as he requested. The less I understood of this farrago, the less I was in a position to judge of its importance, and an appeal so worded could not be set aside without a grave responsibility. I rose accordingly from the table, got into a hansom, and drove straight to Jekyll's house. The butler was awaiting my arrival. He had received by the same post as mine a registered letter of instruction, and had sent at once for a locksmith and a carpenter. The tradesmen came while we were yet speaking, and we moved in a body to old Dr. Denman's surgical theatre, from which, as you are doubtless aware, Jekyll's private cabinet is most conveniently entered. The door was very strong, the locks excellent. The carpenter avowed he would not have great trouble and have to do much damage, if force were to be used, and the locksmith was near despair. But this last was a handy fellow, and after 2 hours' work, the door stood open. The pressed marked E was unlocked, and I took out the drawer, had it filled up with straw, and tied in a sheet, and returned with it to Cavendish Square. Here I proceeded to examine its contents. The powders were neatly enough to made up, but not with the nicety of the dispensing chemist, so that it was plain that they were of Jekyll's private manufacture, and when I opened one of the wrappers, I found that what seemed to me a simple crystalline salt of white color. The phial to which I next turned my attention might have been about half full of blood-red liquor, which was highly pungent to the sense of smell, and seemed to me to contain phosphorus and some volatile ether. At the other ingredients, I could make no guess. The book was an ordinary version book, and contained little but a series of dates. These covered a period of many years, but I observed that the entries ceased nearly a year ago, and quite abruptly. Here and there, a brief remark was appended to a date, usually no more than a single word, double, occurring perhaps 6 times in a total of several hundred entries, and once very early in the list, and followed by several marks of exclamation. Total failure! All this, though it whetted my curiosity, told me little that was definite. Here were a phial of some tincture, a paper of some salts, and a record of series of experiments that had led, like too many of Jekyll's investigations, to no end of practical usefulness. How could the presence of these articles in my house affect either the honor, the sanity, or the life of my flighty colleague? If his messenger could go to one place, why could he not go to another? And even granting some impediment, why was this gentleman to be received by me in secret? The more I reflected, the more convinced I grew that I was dealing with a case of cerebral disease, and though I dismissed my servants to bed, I loaded an old revolver that might be found in some posture of self-defense. 12 o'clock had scarce rung out over London, ere the knocker sounded very gently on the door. I went myself at the summons, and found a small man crouching against the pillars of the portico. "Are you come from Dr. Jekyll?" I asked. He told me yes, by a constrained gesture, and when I had bidden him enter, he did not obey me without a searching backward glance into the darkness of the square. There was a policeman not far off, advancing with his bull's eye open, and at the sight I thought my visitor started, and made greater haste. These particulars struck me, I confess, disagreeably, and as I followed him into the bright light of a consulting room, I held my hand ready on my weapon. Here, at last, I had a chance of clearly seeing him. I had never set my eyes on him before, so much was certain. He was small, as I have said. I was struck beside with a shocking expression on his face, with his remarkable combination of great muscular activity and great apparent debility of constitution, and, last but not least, with the odd subjective disturbance caused by his neighborhood. This bore some resemblance in incipient rigor, and was accompanied by a marked sinking of the pulse. At the time, I set it down to some idiosyncratic personal distaste and merely wondered at the acuteness of the symptoms, and I have since had reason to believe the cause to lie much deeper in the nature of man and to turn on some nobler hinge than the principle of hatred. This person who had thus from the moment of his entrance struck in me what I can only describe as disgusting curiosity, was dressed in a fashion that would have made an ordinary person laughable. His clothes, that is to say, although they were of rich, sober fabric, were enormously too large for him in every measurement. The trousers hanging off his legs and rolled up to keep them from the ground, the waist of his coat below his haunches, and the collar sprawling wide upon his shoulder. Strange to relate, this ludicrous accoutrement was far from moving me to laughter, rather as there was something abnormal and misbegotten in the very essence of the creature that now faced me, something seizing, surprising, and revolting. This fresh disparity seemed but to fit in with and to reinforce it, so that my interest in the man's nature and character, there was added a curiosity as to his origin, his life, his fortune, and status in the world. These observations, though they have taken so great a space to set down in, were yet the work of a few seconds. My visitor was indeed on fire with somber excitement. "Have you got it?" he cried. "Have you got it?" And so lively with his impatience that he even laid his hand upon my arm and sought to shake me. I put him back, conscious at his touch of a certain icy pang along my blood. "Come, sir," said I. "You forget that I have yet the pleasure of your acquaintance. Be seated, if you please." And I showed him an example and sat myself down in my customary seat and with as fair an imitation of an ordinary manner to a patient, as the lateness of the house, the nature of my preoccupations, and the horror I had of my visitor would suffer me to muster. "I beg your pardon, Dr. Lanyon," he replied civilly. "What you say is very founded, and my impatience has shown its heel to my politeness. I come here at the insistence of my colleague, Dr. Henry Jekyll, on a piece of business of some moment, and I understood." He paused, put his hand to his throat, and I could see, in spite of his collected manner, that he was wrestling against the approaches of hysteria. "I understood a drawer?" But here I took pity on my visitor's suspense, and some perhaps on my own growing curiosity. "There it is, sir," said I, pointing to the drawer, where it lay on the floor behind a table and still covered in the sheet. He sprang to it and then paused, and laid his hand upon his heart. I could hear his teeth grate with the convulsive action of his jaws, and his face was so ghastly to see that I grew alarmed both for his life and reason. "Compose yourself," said I. He turned a dreadful smile to me, as if with the decision of despair, plucked away the sheet. At the sight of the contents, he uttered a loud sob of such immense relief that I sat petrified. And the next moment, in a voice he was already fairly well under control. "Have you a graduated glass?" he asked. I rose from my place with something of an effort and gave him what he asked. He thanked me with a smiling nod, measured out a few minims of the red tincture, and added one of the powders. The mixture, which was at first of a reddish hue, began in the proportion as the crystals melted to brighten in color, to effervescence audibly, and to throw off small fumes of vapor. Suddenly, and at the same moment, the ebullition ceased, and the compound changed to a dark purple, which faded again more slowly to a watery green. My visitor, who had watched these metamorphoses with a keen eye, smiled, sat down the glass upon the table, and then turned and looked upon me with an air of scrutiny. "And now," said he, "to settle what remains, will you be wise? Will you be guided? Will you suffer me to take this glass in my hand and to go forth from your house without further parley? And has the greed of curiosity too much command of you? Think before you answer, for it shall be done as you decide. As you decide, you shall be left as you were before, and neither richer or wiser, unless the sense of service rendered to a man in mortal distress may be counted as a kind of riches of the soul. Or if you shall so prefer to choose a new province of knowledge, and new avenues to fame and power shall be laid open to you here in this room, upon the instant, and your sight shall be blasted by a prodigy to stagger the unbelief of Satan. Sir, said I, affecting a coolness that I was far from truly possessing, you speak enigmas, and you will perhaps not wonder that I hear you with no strong impression of belief. But I have gone too far in the way of inexplicable service to pause before I see the end. It is well, replied my visitor. Lanyon, you remember your vows. What follows is under the seal of our profession. And now, you who have so long been bound to the most narrow and material views, you who have denied the virtue of transcendental medicine, you who have decided your superiors, behold! He put the glass to his lips and drank at one gulp. A cry followed. He reeled, staggered, clutched at the table, and held on, staring with injected eyes, gasping with open mouth. And as I looked, there came, I thought, a change. He seemed to swell. His face became suddenly black, and the features seemed to melt and alter. And the next moment I had sprung to my feet and leaped back against the wall, my arm raised to shield me from that prodigy, my mind submerged in terror. Oh God, I screamed, and oh God, again and again, for there before my eyes, pale and shaken, and half fainting, and groping before him with his hands like a man restored from death, there stood Henry Jekyll. When he told me in the next hour, I cannot bring my mind to set on paper. I saw what I saw, I heard what I heard, and my soul sickened at it, and yet now that sight has faded from my eyes. I ask myself if I believe it, and I cannot answer. My life is shaken to its roots. Sleep has left me. The deadliest terror sits by me in all hours of the day and night. I feel that my days are numbered, and that I must die, and yet I shall die incredulous. As for the moral turpitude that man unveiled to me, even with the tears of penitence, I cannot, even in memory, dwell on it without a start of horror. I will say but one thing, utter sin, and that, if you can bring your mind to credit it, will be more than enough. The creature who crept into my house that night was, on Jekyll's own confession, known by the name of Hyde, and hunted for in every corner of the land as the murderer of Carew. Signed, Hasty Lanyon. Next chapter. Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. I was born in the year 18 to a large fortune, endowed beside with excellent parts, inclined by nature to industry, fond of the respect of the wise and good among my fellow men, and thus, as might have been supposed, with every guarantee of an honorable and distinguished future. And indeed the worst of my faults was a certain impatient gaiety of disposition, such as been made the happiness of many, but such as I found it hard to reconcile with my imperious desire to carry my head high, and wear a more than commonly grave countenance before the public. Hence it came about that I concealed my pleasures, and that when I reached years of reflection and began to look around me and take stock of my progress and position in the world, I stood already committed to a profound duplicity of life. Many a man would have been blazoned such irregularities as I was guilty of, but from the high views I had set before me, I regarded and hid them with an almost morbid sense of shame. It was thus rather the exacting nature of my aspirations than any particular degradation in my faults that made me what I was, and, with even a deeper trench than in the majority of men, severed in me these provinces of good and ill which divide and compound man's dual nature. In this case, I was driven to reflect deeply and inveterably that I was hard law of life, which lies at the root of religion and is one of the most plentiful springs of distress. Though so profound a double dealer, I was in no sense a hypocrite. Both sides of me were in deep, dead earnest. I was in no more myself than I was laid aside, restraint, and plunged in shame than when I labored in the eye of day at the furtherance of knowledge or the relief of sorrow and suffering. And it chanced that the direction of my scientific studies, which led wholly towards the mystic and transcendental, reacted and shed a strong light on this consciousness of the perennial war among my members. With every day, and from both sides of my intelligence, the moral and the intellectual, I drew steadily nearer to that truth, by whose partial discovery I had doomed to such a dreadful shipwreck, that man is not truly one, but truly two. I say two because the state of my knowledge does not pass beyond that point. Others will follow, others will outstrip me on the same lines, and I hazard the guess that man will ultimately be known for a mere polity of multifarious, incongruous, and independent denizens. I, for my part, from the nature of my life, advanced infallibly in one direction only. It was on the moral side, in my own person, that I learned to recognize the thorough and primitive duality of man. I saw that, of the two natures that contended in the field of my consciousness, even if I could rightly be said to be either, it was only because I was radically both, and from an early date, even before the course of my scientific discoveries that had begun to suggest the most naked possibility of such a miracle. I had learned to dwell with pleasure, as a beloved daydream, on the thought of the separation of these elements. If each, I told myself, could be but housed in separate identities, life would be relieved of all that was unbearable. The unjust might go away, delivered from the aspirations and remorse of his more upright twin. The just could walk steadfastly and securely on his upright path, doing the good things in which he found his pleasure, and no longer exposed to disgrace and penitence by the hands of this extraneous evil. It was the curse of mankind that these incongruous bag of sticks were thus bound together, that in the agonizing womb of conscientiousness, these polar twins should be continuously struggling. How then were they disassociated? I was so far in my reflections when I have said a sidelight began to shine upon the subject from the laboratory table. I began to perceive more deeply than it has ever been stated the trembling immateriality, the mist-like transience of the seemingly so solid body in which we walk attired. Certain agents I found to have the power to shake and to pluck back that fleshly vestment, even as the wind might toss the curtains of a pavilion. For two good reasons, I will not enter deeply into this scientific branch of my confession. First, because I have been made to learn that the doom and burden of our life is bound forever on a man's shoulder, and when the attempt is made to cast it off, it returns upon us with more unfamiliar and more awful pressure. Second, because, as my narrative will make, alas, too evident, my discoveries were incomplete. Enough, then, that I not only recognized my natural body for mere aura and effulgence of certain of the powers that made my spirit, but managed to compound a drug by which these powers should be dethroned from their supremacy, and a second form and countenance substituted, none the less natural to me because they were the expression and bore the stamp of lower elements in my soul. I hesitated long before I put this theory into the test of practice. I knew well that I risked death for any drug that so potently controlled and shook the very fortress of identity might be the least scruple of an overdose, or at least inopportunity in the moment of exhibition. Utterly block out that immaterial tabernacle which I looked to it to change. But the temptation of a discovery so singular and profound, alas, overcome the suggestions of alarm. I had long since prepared my tincture. I purchased at once from a firm of wholesale chemists a large quantity of a particular salt which I knew from my experiments to be the last ingredient required. And late one accursed night I compounded the elements, watched them boil and smoke together in the glass, and when the ebullition was subsided, with a strong glow of courage, drank off the potion. The most racking pang succeeded, a grinding in the bones, deadly nausea, and a horror of the spirit that could not be exceeded at the hour of birth or death. Then these agonies began swiftly to subside, and I came to myself as if out of great sickness. There was something strange in my sensations, something indescribably new, and from its very novelty, incredibly sweet. I felt younger, lighter, happier in my body. Within, I was conscious of a heady recklessness, a current of disordered sensual images running like a mill race in my fancy, a solution of the bonds of obligation, an unknown but not an innocent freedom of the soul. I knew myself at the first breath of this new life to be more wicked, tenfold more wicked, sold a slave to my original evil, and the thought in that moment braced and delighted me like wine. I stretched out my hands, exulting in the freshness of these sensations, and in the act, I suddenly was aware that I had lost in stature. There was no mirror at that date in my room. That which stands beside me as I write was brought there later on and for the very purpose of these transformations. The night, however, was far from gone. Into the morning, black as it was nearly ripe for the conception of day. The inmates of my house were locked in the most rigorous hours of slumber, and I determined, flushed as I was with hope and triumph, to venture in my new shape as far as to my bedroom. I crossed the yard wherein the constellations looked down upon me. I could have thought with wonder, the first creature of that sort, that their unsleeping vigilance has yet disclosed to them. I stole through the corridors, a stranger in my own house, and coming to my room, I saw for the first time the appearance of Edward Hyde. I must here speak by theory alone, saying not that which I know, but that which I suppose to be most probable. The evil side of my nature, to which I have now transferred the stamping efficacy, was less robust and less developed than the good which I had just disposed. Again, in the course of my life, which had been, after all, 9/10 a life of effort, virtue, and control, it had been much less exercised and much less exhausted. And hence, as I think, it came about that Edward Hyde was so much smaller, slighter, and younger than Henry Jekyll. Even as good shone upon the countenance of the one, evil was written broadly and plainly at the face of the other. Evil besides, which I must still believe to be the lethal side of man, had left on that body an imprint of deformity and decay. And yet when I looked upon that ugly idol in that glass, I was unconscious of no repugnance, rather of a leap of welcome. This, too, was myself. It seemed natural and human. In my eyes it bore a livelier image of the spirit. It seemed more to express in single than the imperfect and divided countenance I had been hitherto accustomed to call mine. And in so far I was doubtlessly right. I have observed that when I wore the semblance of Edward Hyde, none would come near to me at first without a visible misgiving of the flesh. This, as I take it, was because all human beings, as we meet them, are commingled out of good and evil, and Edward Hyde, alone in the ranks of mankind, was pure evil. I lingered but a moment at the mirror. The second and conclusive experiment had yet to be attempted. It yet remained to be seen if I had lost my identity and beyond redemption and must flee before daylight from a house that no longer mine. And hurrying back to my cabinet, I once more prepared and drank the cup, once more suffered the pangs of dissolution, and came to myself once more with the character and stature of the face of Henry Jekyll. That night I had come to the fatal crossroads. Had I approached my discovery in a more noble spirit, had I risked the experiment while under the empire of generous or pious aspirations, all must have been otherwise, and from the agonies of death and birth I had come forth an angel instead of a fiend. The drug had no discriminating action. It was neither diabolical nor divine. It but shook the door of the prison house of my disposition, and like the captives of the Philippi, which stood within, ran forth. At that time my virtue slumbered. My evil, kept awake by ambition, was alert and swift to seize the occasion, and the thing that was projected was Edward Hyde. Hence, although I now two characters as well as two appearances, that one was wholly evil, and the other was still the old Henry Jekyll, and that incongruous compound of whose Reformation improvement I had already learned to despair. The movement was thus wholly toward the worst. Even at that time, I had yet conquered my aversions to the dryness of a life of study. I would still be merrily disposed at times, and as my pleasures were, to say the least, undignified, and I was not only well known and highly considered, but growing towards the elderly man, this incoherency of my life was daily growing more unwelcome. It was on this side that my new power tempted me until I fell into slavery. I had but to drink the cup, to doff at once the body of the noted professor, and to assume like a thick cloak that of Edward Hyde. I smiled at the notion. It seemed to me at the time to be humorous, and I made my preparations with the most studious care. I took and furnished the house in Soho, to which Hyde was tracked by the police, and engaged as a housekeeper a creature whom I knew too well to be silent and scrupulous. On the other side, I announced to my servants that a Mr. Hyde, whom I described, was to have full liberty and power about my house in the square, and to parry mishaps. I even called and made myself a familiar object in my second character. I next drew up that will to which you so much objected, so that if anything befell me in the person of Dr. Jekyll, I could enter on that of Edward Hyde without pecuniary loss, and thus fortified, as I supposed, on every side, I began to profit by the strange immunities of my position. Men have before hired bravos to transact their crimes, while their own person and reputation sat under shelter. I was the first that ever did so for his pleasures. I was the first that could thus plod in the public eye with a load of genial respectability, and in a moment, like a schoolboy, strip off these lendings and spring headlong into a sea of liberty. But for me, in my impenetrable mantle, the safety was complete. Think of it. I did not even exist. Let me but escape into my laboratory door. Give me but a second or two to mix and swallow the draught that I had always standing ready. And whatever had done, Edward Hyde would pass away like the stain of a breath upon a mirror. And there in his stead, quietly at home, trimming the midnight lamp in his study, a man who could afford to laugh at suspicion would be Henry Jekyll. The pleasures which I made haste to seek in my disguise were, as I have said, undignified. I would scarce use a harder term. But in the hands of Edward Hyde, they soon began to turn towards the monstrous. When I would come back from these excursions, I was often plunged into a kind of wonder of my vicarious depravity. This familiarity that I called out of my own soul and sent forth alone to do his good pleasure was a being inherently malign and villainous. His every act and thought centered on the self, drinking pleasure with his bestial avidity, from any degree of torture to another, relentless like a man of stone. Henry Jekyll stood at times aghast before the acts of Edward Hyde, but the situation was apart from ordinary laws and insidiously relaxed the grasp of conscience. It was Hyde, after all, and Hyde alone, that was guilty. Jekyll was no worse. He woke again to his good qualities, seemingly unimpaired. He would even make haste, where it was possible, to undo the evil done by Mr. Hyde, and thus his conscience slumbered. Into the details of the infamy at which I thus connived, for even now I could scarce grant that I committed it, I have no design of entering. I mean to point out the warnings and the successive steps with which my chastisement approached. I met with one accident which, as it brought no consequence, I shall no more than mention an act of cruelty to a child aroused against me the anger of a passer-by, whom I recognized the other day in the person of your kinsman. The doctor and the child's family joined him. There were moments when I feared my life, and at last, in order to pacify their too just resentment, Edward Hyde had to bring them to the door and pay them in a check drawn in the name of Henry Jekyll. But this danger was easily eliminated from the future by opening an account at another bank in the name of Edward Hyde himself. And when, by sloping his hand backward, I had supplied my double with a signature, I thought I sat beyond the reach of fate. Some 2 months before the murder of Sir Danvers, I had been out for one of my adventures, had returned at a late hour, and woke the next day in a bed with somewhat an odd sensation. It was in vain I looked about me. In vain I saw the decent furniture and tall proportions of my room in the square. In vain that I recognized the pattern of the bed curtains and the design of the mahogany frame. Something still kept insisting that I was not where I was, that I had not wakened where I seemed to be, but in the little room in Soho where I was accustomed to sleep in the body of Edward Hyde. I smiled to myself, and in my psychological way began lazily to inquire into the elements of this illusion, occasionally, even as I did so, dropping back into the comfortable morning doze. I was still so engaged when, in one of my more wakeful moments, my eye fell upon my hand. Now the hand of Henry Jekyll, as you have often remarked, was professional in shape and size. It was large, firm, white, and comely. But the hand which I now saw clearly enough in the yellow light of the mid-London morning, lying half shut on the bed of clothes, was lean, corded, knuckly, of a dusk pallor, and thickly shaded with the smart growth of hair. It was the hand of Edward Hyde. I must have stared upon it for nearly half a minute, and sunk as I was in the mere stupidity of wonder, before terror woke up in my breast as sudden and startling as the crash of cymbals, and bounding from my bed, I rushed to the mirror. At the sight that met my eyes, my blood was changed into something exquisitely thin and icy. Yes, I had gone to bed Henry Jekyll. I had wakened as Edward Hyde. How was this to be explained? I asked myself, and then with another bound of terror, how was it to be remedied? It was well in the morning. The servants were up. All my drugs were in the cabinet. A long journey down 2 pairs of stairs and through the back passage along the open court and through the anatomical theater, from where I was then standing horror-struck. It might indeed be possible to cover my face, but of what use was that when I was unable to conceal the alterations of my stature? And then, with an overpowering sweetness of relief, it came back upon my mind that the servants were already used to the coming and going of my second self. I had soon dressed, and as well as I was able, in the clothes of my own size, had soon passed through the house where Bradshaw stared and drew back at seeing Mr. Hyde at such an hour, in such a way, and such a strange array, and 10 minutes later Dr. Jekyll had returned to his own shape and was sitting down with a darkened brow to make a feint of breakfasting. Small indeed was my appetite. This inexplicable incident, this reversal of my previous experience, seemed like the Babylonian finger on the wall, to be spelling out the letters of my judgment. And I began to reflect more seriously than ever before on this issue and possibilities of my double existence. That part of me, which I had the power of projecting, had lately been more exercised and nourished. It had seemed to me, as of late, as though the body of Edward Hyde had grown in stature, as though, when I wore that form, I was conscious of a more generous tide of blood, and I began to spy a danger of that. If this were more prolonged, the balance of my nature might be more permanently overthrown. The power of voluntary change may be forfeited, and the character of Edward Hyde become irrevocably mine. The power of the drug had not always been equally displayed. Once, very early in my career, it had totally failed me. Since then, I had been obliged on more than one occasion to double, and once with infinite risk of death to treble the amount. And these rare uncertainties had cast hitherto the sole shadow of my contentment. Now, however, and in the light of that morning's accident, I was led to remark that whereas in the beginning the difficulty had been to throw off the body of Jekyll, it had late gradually but decidedly transferred itself to the other side. All things therefore seemed to point to this, that I was slowly losing hold of my original and better self, and becoming slowly incorporated with my second and worse. Between these two I now felt I had to choose. My two natures had memory in common, but all faculties were most unequally shared between them. Jekyll, who was composite, now with the most sensitive apprehensions, now with the greedy gusto projected and shared in the pleasures and adventures of Hyde. But Hyde was indifferent to Jekyll, but remembered him as the mountain bandit remembers the cavern in which he conceals himself from pursuit. Jekyll had more than a father's interest. Hyde had more than a son's indifference. To cast in my lot with Jekyll was to hide, but was to die to those appetites which I had long secretly indulged, and of late began to pamper. To cast it in with Hyde was to die to 1,000 interests and aspirations, and to become at a blow and forever despised and friendless. The bargain might appear unequal, but there was still another consideration in the scales, for while Jekyll would suffer smartingly in the fires of abstinence, Hyde would not be even conscious of all that he had lost. Strange as my circumstances were, the terms of this debate are as old and commonplace as man. Much the same inducements and alarms cast the die for any tempted and trembling sinners, and it fell out with me as it falls with so vast a majority of my fellows, that I chose the better part and was found wanting in the strength to keep it. Yes, I preferred the elderly and discontented doctor, surrounded by friends and cherishing honest hopes, and bade a resolute farewell to the liberty and comparative youth, the light step, leaping pulses, and secret pleasures that I had enjoyed in the disguise of Hyde. I made this choice perhaps with some unconscious reservation, for I neither gave up the house in Soho nor destroyed the clothes of Edward Hyde, which still lay ready in my cabinet. For 2 months, however, I was true to my determination. For 2 months I led a life of such severity as I had never before attained to, and enjoyed the compensations of an approving conscience. But time began at last to obliterate the freshness of my alarm. The praises of conscience began to grow into a thing of course. I began to be tortured with throes and longing, as of Hyde struggling after freedom, and at last, in an hour of moral weakness, I once again compounded and swallowed the transforming draught. I do not suppose that, when a drunkard reasons with himself upon his vice, he is once out of 500 times affected by the dangers that he runs through this brutish and physical insensibility. Neither had I, long as I had considered my position, made enough allowance for the complete moral insensibility and insensate readiness to evil, which were the leading characterizations of Edward Hyde. Yet it was by these that I was punished. My devil had been long caged. He came out roaring. I was conscious, even when I took the draught, of a more unbridled, a more furious propensity to ill. It must have been this, I suppose, that stirred in my soul the tempest of impatience with which I listened to the civilities of my unhappy victim. I declare, at least, before God, no man morally sane could have been guilty of that crime upon so pitiful a provocation, that I struck in no more reasonable spirit than that in which a sick child may break a plaything. But I had voluntarily stripped myself of all these balancing instincts, by which even the worst of us continues to walk with some degree of steadiness among temptations, and in my case to be tempted, however slightly, was to fall. Instantly, the spirit of hell awoke in me and raged. With a transport of glee, I mauled the unresisting body, tasting delight from every blow, and it was not till weariness had begun to succeed that I was suddenly in the top fit of my delirium, struck through the heart by a cold thrill of terror. A mist dispersed. I saw my life to be forfeit, and fled from the scene of these excuses, at once glorying and trembling, my lust of evil gratified and stimulated, my love of life screwed to the topmost peg. I ran to the house in Soho, and to my assurance doubly sure, destroyed my papers. Thence I set out through the lamplit streets to the same divided ecstasy of mind, gloating on my crime, light-headedly devising others in the future, and yet still hastily, still hearkeningly, in my wake for the steps of the avenger. Hyde had a song upon his lips as he compounded the draught, and as he drank it, pledged the dead man. The pangs of transformation had not yet done tearing him before Henry Jekyll, with streaming tears of gratitude and remorse, had fallen upon his knees and lifted his hands to God. The veil of self-indulgence was rent from head to toe. I saw my life as a whole. I followed it up from the days of childhood, when I had walked with my father's hands, and through the self-denying toils of my professional life, to arrive again and again with the same sense of unreality at the demand horrors of the evening. I could have screamed aloud. I sought with tears and prayers to smother down the crowd of hideous images and sounds with which my memory swarmed against me, and still, between the petitions, the ugly face of my iniquity staring into my soul. As the acuteness of this remorse began to die away, it was succeeded by a sense of joy. The problem of my conduct was solved. Hyde was thenceforth impossible. Whether I would or not, I was now confined to the better part of my existence, and oh, how I rejoiced to think it. With what willing humility I embraced anew the restrictions of natural life. With that sincere renunciation, I locked the door by which I had so often gone and come, and ground the key under my heel. The next day came the news that the murder had been overlooked, that the guilt of Hyde was patent to the world, and that the victim was a man high in public estimation. It was not only a crime, it had been a tragic folly. I think I was glad to know it. I think I was glad to have my better impulses thus buttressed and guarded by the terrors of the scaffold. Jekyll was now my city of refuge. Let but Hyde peep out an instant, and the hands of all men would be raised to take and slay him. I resolved in my future conduct to redeem the past, and I can say with honesty that my resolve was fruitful of some good. You know yourself how earnestly in the last months of the last year I labored to relieve suffering. You know that much of it was done for others, and that the days passed quietly, almost happily for myself. Not only can I truly say that I was wearied of this beneficence and innocent life, I think instead that I daily enjoyed it more completely. But I was still cursed with my duality of purpose. And as the first edge of my penitence wore off, the lower side of me, so long indulged, so recently chained down, began to growl for license. Not that I dreamed of resuscitating Hyde. The bare idea of that would startle me to frenzy. No, it was my own person, that I was once more tempted to trifle with my conscience. And it was an ordinary secret sinner that I at last fell before the assaults of temptation. There comes an end to all things. The most capacious measure is filled at last, and this brief condensation to my evil finally destroyed the balance of my soul. And yet I was not alarmed. The fall seemed natural, like a return to the old days before I had made my discovery. It was a fine, clear January day, wet under the foot where the frost had melted, but cloudless overhead, and the Regent's Park was full of the winter chirruping and sweet with spring odors. I sat in the sun on the bench, the animal within me licking the chops of memory, the spiritual side a little drowsed, promising subsequent penitence, but not yet moved to begin. After all, I reflected, I was like my neighbors, and then I smiled, comparing myself with the other men, comparing my active goodwill with the lazy cruelty of their neglect. And at the very moment of that vainglorious thought, a qualm came over me, a horrid nausea, and the most deadly shuddering. These passed away and left me faint, and then, as in its turn, the faintness subsided. I began to be aware of a change in the temper of my thoughts, a greater boldness, a contempt of danger, a solution of the bonds of obligation. I looked down, my clothes hung formlessly on my shrunken limbs, the hand that lay upon my knee and corded and hairy. I was once more Edward Hyde. A moment before, I had been safe of all men's respect, wealthy, beloved. The cloth laying for me in the dining room at home, and now I was in the common quarry of mankind, hunted, houseless, a known murderer, thrall to the gallows. My reason wavered, but it did not fail me utterly. I have more than once observed that in my second character, my faculties seemed to sharpen to a point, and my spirits more tensely elastic. Thus it came about where Jekyll's perhaps might have succumbed. Hyde rose to the importance of the moment. My drugs were in one of the presses of my cabinet. How was I to reach them? That was the problem that, crushing my temples in my hands, I set myself to solve. The laboratory door had closed. If I sought to enter by the house, my own servants would consign me to the gallows. I saw I must employ another hand and thought of Lanyon. How was he to be reached? How persuaded? Supposing that I escaped captured in the street, how was I to make my way into his presence? And how would I, a known and displeasing visitor, prevail on the famous physician to rifle the study of his colleague, Dr. Jekyll? Then I remembered that my original character, one part remained to me. I could write my own hand, and at once I had conceived that kindling spark. The way I must follow became lighted up from end to end. Thereupon I arranged my clothes as best as I could, and summoning a passing hansom, drove to a hotel in Portland Street, the name of which I chanced to remember. At my appearance, which was indeed comical enough, however tragic a fate these garments covered, the driver could not conceal his mirth. I gnashed my teeth upon him with a gust of devilish fury, and the smile withered from his face. Happily for him, yet more happily for me, for in another instant I had certainly dragged him from his perch. At the inn, as I entered, I looked about me with so black a countenance as made the attendants tremble. Not a look did they exchange in my presence, but obsequiously took my order, led me to a private room, and brought me wherewithal to write. Hyde, in my danger of his life, was a creature new to me, shaken with inordinate anger, strung to the pitch of murder, lusting to inflict pain. That the creature was astute, mastered his fury with a great effort of the will, composed his two important letters, one to Lanyon and one to Poole, that he might receive actual evidence of their being posted, sent them out with directions that they should be registered. Thenceforward he sat all day over the fire in the private room, gnawing his nails. There he dined, sitting alone in his fear, the waiter visibly quailing before his eyes, and thence when the night fully come, he set forth to the corner of a closed cab, and was driven to and fro about the streets of the city. He, I cannot say, that child of hell, had nothing human, nothing lived in him but fear and hatred. And when at last, thinking the driver had begun to grow suspicious, he discharged the cab and ventured on foot, attired in his misfitting clothes, an object marked out for observation, into the midst of the nocturnal passengers. These two base passions raged within him like a tempest. He walked fast, hunted by his fears, chattering to himself, skulking through the less frequented thoroughfares, counting the minutes that still divided him from midnight. Once a woman spoke to him, offering, I think, a box of lights. He smote her in the face, and she fled. When I came to myself at Lanyon's, the horror of my friend perhaps affected me somewhat. I do not know. It was at least but a drop in the sea of the abhorrence with which I looked back upon these hours. A change had come over me. It was no longer the fear of the gallows. It was the horror of being Hyde that racked me. I received Lanyon's condemnation part in a dream. It was partly in a dream that I came home to my own home and got into bed. I slept after the prostration of the day, with a stringent and profound slumber which not even the nightmares that wrung me could avail to break. I awoke in the morning shaken, weakened, but refreshed. I still hated and feared the thought of the brute that slept within me, and I had not, of course, forgotten the appalling dangers of the day before. But I was once more at home, in my own house, close to my drugs, and gratitude for my escape shone so strong in my soul that it almost rivaled the brightness of hope. I was stepping leisurely across the court after breakfast, drinking the chill of the air with pleasure, when I was seized again with those indescribable sensations that heralded the change, and I had but the time to gain the shelter of my cabinet before I was once again raging and freezing with the passions of Hyde. It took on this occasion a double dose to recall me to myself, and at last 6 hours after, as I sat looking sadly in the fire, the pangs returned. The drug had to be readministered. In short, from that day forth, it seemed only be a great effort as of gymnastics, and only under the immediate stimulation of the drug that I was able to wear the countenance of Jekyll. At all hours of the day and night, I would be taken with the premonitory shudder. Above all, if I slept or even dozed for a moment in my chair, it was always as Hyde that I awakened. Under the strain of this continually impending doom, and by the sleeplessness to which I now condemned myself, even beyond what I had thought possible to man, I became in my own person a creature eaten up and emptied by fever, languidly weak both in hand and mind, and solely occupied by one thought, the horror of my other self. But when I slept, or when the virtue of the medicine wore off, I would leap almost without transition, for the pangs of the transformation grew less marked daily, into the possession of the fancy brimming with the images of horror, a soul boiling with causeless hatred, and a body that seemed not strong enough to contain the rage energy of life. The powers of Hyde seemed to groan in the sickliness of Jekyll, and certainly the hate that now divided them was equal on each side. With Jekyll, it was a thing of vital instinct. He now had seen the full deformity of that creature that shared with him some of the phenomena of consciousness, and was co-heir with him to death. And beyond these links of community, which in themselves made the most poignant part of his distress, he thought of Hyde, for all his energy of life, as of something not only hellish, but inorganic. This was a shocking thing, that the slime of the pit seemed to utter cries and voices, that the amorphous dust gesticulated and sinned, that what was dead and had no shape would usurp the offices of life, and this again, that insurgent horror was knit to him closer than a wife, closer than an eye, lay caged in his flesh, where he heard it mutter and felt it struggle to be born, and at every hour of weakness and in the confidence of slumber prevailed against him and deposed him out of life. The hatred of Hyde for Jekyll was of a different order. His terror of the gallows drove him continually to commit temporary suicide and return to his subordinate station of a part instead of a person. But he loathed the necessity, he loathed the despondency in which Jekyll was now fallen, and he resented the dislike with which he himself regarded. Hence the ape-like tricks that he would play me, scrawling in my own hand blasphemy on the pages of my books, burning the letters and destroying the portrait of my father. And indeed, had it not been for his fear of death, he would long ago have ruined himself in order to involve me in the ruin. But his love of life is wonderful. I go further. I, who sicken and freeze at the mere thought of him, when I recall the abjection and passion of this attachment, and when I know how he fears my power to cut him off by suicide, I find it in my heart to pity him. It is useless, and the time awfully fails me, to prolong this description. No one has ever suffered such torments. Let it suffice. And yet even to these habit brought, no, not alleviation, but a certain callousness of soul, a certain acquiescence of despair, and my punishment might have gone on for years before the last calamity which has now fallen, and which has finally severed me from my own face and nature. My provision of the salt, which had never been renewed since the date of the first experiment, began to run low. I sent out for a fresh supply and mixed the draught, and the ebullition followed, and the first change of color, nor the second. I drank it, and it was without efficacy. You will learn from Poole how I have had London ransacked. It was in vain, and I am now persuaded that my first supply was impure, and that it was that unknown impurity which lent efficacy to the draught. About a week has passed, and I am now finishing this statement under the influence of the last of the old powders. This, then, is the last time, short of a miracle, that Henry Jekyll can think his own thoughts or see his own face, now how sadly altered in the glass. Nor must I delay too long to bring my writing to an end, for if my narrative was hitherto escaped destruction, it had been by a combination of great prudence and with good luck. Should the throes of change take me in the act of writing it, Hyde will tear it into pieces, but if some time shall have elapsed after I have laid it by, his wonderful selfishness and circumscription to the moment will probably save it once again from the action of his ape-like spite. And indeed the doom that is closing on both of us has already changed and crushed him. Half an hour from now, when I shall again and forever re-endue that hatred personality, I know how I shall sit shuddering and weeping in my chair and continue with the most strained and fear-struck ecstasy of listening to pace up and down this room, my last earthly refuge, and give ear to every sound of menace. Will Hyde die upon the scaffold, or will he find the courage to release himself at the last moment? God knows, I am careless. This is my true hour of death, and what is to follow concerns another than myself. Here then, as I lay down the pen and proceed to seal up the confession, I bring to life that unhappy Henry Jekyll to an end. It's getting good. Oh my gosh. Okay, that was a long chapter. I'm so thirsty. Solid hour of reading. Ugh. Yes, Ali, go back to the beginning. I'm sure that message was like a very long time ago. Oh my goodness, sorry. I need some water. Some water. I go back and read some super chats. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Jekyll needs higher vitality. Needs a health increase. I mean, this is what happens when you play with splitting yourself, I suppose. Splitting yourself. Okay. Also, earlier when I said the bag of sticks, it was the word that will get you in trouble. So the F word with 6 letters. Or, you know, I feel like you guys know. That was crazy. All right, we got Patriotic Gestalt for $5. Has no message. Thank you, Patriotic Gestalt. I appreciate that. And then Ian Soforth for 50 British pounds. Holy crap. 19th century literature rules. It does. I think there's something beautiful. And I mean, I'm quite sure I butchered a lot of the words, but it the writing is just so much more beautiful, well thought out, eloquent, explaining the words they use is just it seems more what's the word for it? High leveled language. I don't know. I can't think of it. No, that's not the F word, Nick. It was eloquent. Yes, thank you, Holocron. It's like maggot, but with an F. I don't think I'm supposed to say that word, but it was in the book, so that's why I said bag of sticks. Oh my gosh, Eric K for $5 on the donation side says a watching fee. Thank you. You don't have to do that. You guys are very kind to me today. I appreciate it. I hope you guys enjoyed it. You're just trolling. Oh, thanks, bro. Let's see. A bigger vocabulary. I mean, there were some words that I did not even like know, and I'm quite sure I butchered it. I'm trying to find one. Like unscrupulously. Don't really know what that word means. I'm gonna have to look it up after. There's a couple in there that was like, whoa, how do you say this? I don't understand. This was a great chapter. I kind of want to go back and read this chapter where he is his full statement of the case from beginning to end, because this was a doozy. It was cool to be in his mind from the beginning, and you know how he thought this was going to be such a cool thing to divide this, you know, have the good walk around and then the bad version of you to like release everything. But he ended up being like a crazy murderer, and he thought he could get away with it, and then all of a sudden, dang, turns into freaking Jekyll, Hyde, randomly on the street. He keeps turning into him. It's crazy. Scruples are morals. Oh, nice. A bag of sticks sounds like a Louis C.K. joke. Yeah, I mean, this is a great chapter. I was a little thirsty midway through, and I'm like, I don't know how I can keep this up. I might have to take a drink, because I try to drink when I am finished a chapter, so I can cut the chapters up and mark them accordingly. But yeah, this is insane. And I mean, the fact that he thought that maybe his first batch of salt was what made the potion work, and now he basically is like unable to turn back into him. That persona is like dead. Everyone has their lower side released these days. I mean, I'm not gonna be killing anyone. My evil side, I don't think, can do that. My evil side would be more like, I don't know, enjoying time with my husband. That sort of evil side, maybe. Stuff like that, you know? Means to be submissive, subservient, and compliant scrupulously. Okay. There we go. I'm learning words. I mean, I probably had learned them a while ago, but now I'm like relearning. I think I would love to, there's an app out there that you can learn a new word every day. And I think that I probably should go back. I like going back to this educated side of me, because with Forbidden Frontier and now the reading of the books, like, I hope this stimulates my mind. Was the salts called Mad Dog 2020 or vodka? Wow. You know, I would love you to read Call of Cthulhu after this. Patriotic Gestalt, unless it's open domain, I cannot read books on YouTube, at least. I would have to get special permissions to read. I don't even know. Call of Cthulhu sounds like it's a new thing. Call of Cthulhu year released. Let's see. 2018. They probably have copyrights on that, and it's usually around like 100 years or something. So go read some Conan tales. Vodka is my favorite drink. I like wine, as y'all know. The next, I have a bunch of books, but what I'll do is I'll do a poll, and we'll see what I end up watching or reading next. I think I might read a couple of the short stories that people sent me first. Wow. I don't even want to keep up with Eliza Blue stuff, Vanilla. She's just insane. Call of the Cthulhu is a short story by the American writer H.P. Lovecraft, written in 1926. It was first published. Oh, is it open source then? Call of Cthulhu. Open domain. Let's see. Is Call of Cthulhu in public domain? Oh, it's public domain. Public domain. As this work's copyright was not renewed, it entered public domain. Oh, in 1957. So I could do it. For Class A renewal books. Only. Oh wait. Works published in 1928 would have to renew their copyright in either 55 or 56, at least 27 years after first publishing, registered no later than, yeah, as this work was not renewed, it entered public domain. Okay, so it is public domain. Where do I buy this? Is this like an Amazon thing? Oh, H.P. Lovecraft is 100 years old. Well, it says here Call of Cthulhu, Weird Tales, Volume 11, Number 2. Beware After Dark, the world's most stupendous tales of mystery, horror, thrills, and terror, and The Outside and Others. Yeah, I could do a more in-depth look. This is not wiki source, so it's not, of course, the most, you know, accurate. I think there's probably certain stories that are open source or public domain. I'd have to do a better check. But thank you for the recommendation. I highly recommend Dracula for looking. Oh, JM, you weren't here earlier. So I went to a thrift store and guess what I bought for $2.50. Freaking $2.50. Dracula. And I bought for $1.50 the Hunchback of Notre Dame. So if ever I go by a thrift store, I'm just gonna pop in and check the books to see if they have any. Because I mean, as much as I would love to buy some new stuff, like this stuff is like, I don't think I should pay, I don't know, $20 for a book that, you know, is that old. There's some great Warhammer Fantasy and 40K novels, but only by specific offers. And again, those are relatively new, right? So I don't think I could read them. Nice. Dracula is really good, way better than what I expected. So it'll be read at some point because I feel like this series is it's a fun way to kind of hang out, listen to someone read. I'm still getting better. I'm trying to figure out. I think I have a thing where like my lips get dry or too wet, and then it makes my enunciation horrible. So I gotta work on that. So I gotta figure out, maybe it's like a food thing. I definitely know. I think like, especially after playing Dead Space, my blood is pumping a bit too much, so I was a little nervous at the beginning. So I do have Mary Shelley Frankenstein. Yes, I did a course in university called Villains in oh shoot, I forgot the title, but like in literature, Villains in Literature. It was really good. We got through some intense books, some new, mostly old, and that was up there. John Carter of Mars might be good, but hey, probably not used to reading aloud. Yeah, it's been a long time since I've read aloud. I kind of want to get like a proper bookmark so I can read and have it scanned. I might have to change the lighting of the room too so that it's better for reading. So, and maybe I'll put on a librarian look. That would be kind of fun, right? Right? Guys, this was a good stream. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I can't wait for more. I will say, for Victoria era England, Dracula is super sexual. I mean, is that where the vampires became like all like, ooh? I will say, I love Jane Theory. She recommended me to read not the Bible, something Solomon, I believe. She said it was naughty, and I was like, ooh. But I'd have to get a copy. I don't know. Charles Dickens is yeah. Basically anything before the 1900s is public domain, from my understanding. Some stuff that can be a little later in life can likely be if they didn't renew the domain. So it depends. King Solomon's, maybe it's that. I'd have to ask her again. So yeah. Sherlock Holmes, that's definitely on the list too. Solomon Kane, maybe that's the one. Solomon Kane. Is the Bible Yeah, I think so. I could read the Bible, but I would feel like I'd probably burn in hell for reading it if I'm not, you know. Song of Solomon, yes, some biblical scripture is sexual. I'll look up Proverbs 5:19. Well, get all hot and bothered. Maybe I should read that next. I don't know. There's so many books. Yeah. Solomon Kane is like a witch hunter. Oh, have you read the classic I need to watch episode 2. I think tomorrow in the morning I'm gonna wake up, watch episode 2, and start cutting some clips for y'all to enjoy. That show is so good. All right, guys, I gotta go to bed. It's late. I am dead tired. I woke up at like 5:30, 6 o'clock this morning, worked out, and I have to still do a workout tomorrow. So get pump the iron and grow these little muscles. Trying to at least. All right. Thank you very much. We have Sunday Funday tomorrow, and I'll be I won't be on, but I'll be around Forbidden Frontier, so the evening's gonna be very busy. And then Monday, I think we're doing a nooner. I think we're doing nooner. I'm not sure. And then I have D&D. Lots of good streams, and at some point I'll fit in a Dead Space stream. Yeah. So, love you guys very much. Have a very great night, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.